Fantastic job. Thank you for reading that. Very good. All right. So we may have some images here in a moment, but we'll get started right away because I know you just ate, so I can't sit you here too long without you falling asleep. And you probably have some other things to do. But I appreciate those of you who are able to stay for this afternoon so we can continue some of the story. I love to talk about these things, and what I find when I'm preparing for presentations like this is it's really just a challenge to figure out what I'm not going to tell you. So what I'd like to do is share a bit more of the story and then leave a little bit of time at the end for any questions, and maybe that'll draw out some of those other details that I had to cut for the sake of time. Okay? Let me pray one more time before I dive into this. Father in heaven, once again, thank you for the privilege of reflecting on how you've led in the past, and I pray that you'll help it to speak to how you want to lead us now. Help us to hear you as you speak to us, whatever you plan to say. I don't know what that is, but I pray that you will speak to each of us and that we hear you. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So you can click forward there if you'd like, get to where we have some dates. All right, so we talked a bit about Merritt Kellogg, right? Merritt Kellogg in 1859 came to the West Coast. He landed in San Francisco and began to share the faith. And this was at a time when we did not even have a name yet. And so we have this resonance of this kind of wild faith resonating with the Wild West, this place where people went who wanted to explore, and they only stopped because an ocean stopped them. So you expect some creative things to occur, and that's certainly what we see. As we look at the New Testament church, I'll mention just briefly, we had that initial moment where Jesus said, go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, as he just read in the text. Jesus gave the mission and he gave the Spirit. And what developed from that was guided by the needs of the mission and the leadership of the Spirit. And we see other teams develop. So Acts 1:8 there, you see that in Acts 1:8, that's where Jesus is talking to the apostles. And their specific job was to expand the reach of the cause. But you get all the way down to chapter 6, and they're still in Jerusalem. Okay, he said to go to Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, then the ends of the earth. But they're still in Jerusalem by chapter 6. And the apostles are faced with a complaint that is drawn along ethnic lines. The Greek widows are being overlooked in the distribution of food. And there in Acts chapter 6, the apostles, instead of rushing to help the widows, I mean, everybody should help the widows, right? They say, it's not right for us to leave prayer and the ministry of the word to do this. Seems almost cold-hearted, but I think it's not. Because what they do instead is develop another team that will take care of those social needs. And so in Acts chapter 6, we find the development of a team that I associate with the deacons later on. Then a third team also develops as a result of the mission. The apostles are apostling. They're going from place to place throughout Asia Minor. They're starting churches, and they circle back to some of the churches in Acts 14, and they discover that the local scene is not all they would hope it would be. And so they develop a new team of elders to be local spiritual guides. So again, it's the mission and the Spirit that gives rise to all the pieces. First apostles, then deacons, then elders, and this is how they carry forward the mission. I see the same thing happening in the Adventist story, and I want to tell you a little bit about those three big structures. You see up on the top there, publishing, medicine, and education. I mentioned briefly that back in Battle Creek, they established publishing. It had actually started in the Northeast. Then they went to healthcare, then they went to education. So out here on the West Coast, back to Merritt Kellogg. Merritt Kellogg is there in 59. He's sharing his faith, and people are responding. And it's a very pioneering group that's responding, and they start saying, we need to bring out some evangelists. You're doing fine, Merritt, but you're a carpenter. Let's bring some real evangelists out to California because people are going to love to hear this message. So they write a letter back to Battle Creek. James White receives it, and he says, that sounds like a great idea. I don't have anybody to send. Later on, they send another letter. Merritt and his group there in San Francisco. This time they send gold. It's California, gold rush era. They have gold. They send a bunch of gold. Here's some money to bring an evangelist out. James White writes back and says, thanks for the gold. Still a great idea. Still no one to send. So in 1868, Merritt, actually it's 1867, Merritt decides to leave California for a while. He goes out to New Jersey to get his medical degree, because that's like a 6-month process. Yeah. And he becomes Dr. Merritt Kellogg. 6 months, yeah. And he circles back to Battle Creek in time for the General Conference session of 1868. Meanwhile, John Loughborough is there. John Loughborough is that same man that was arguing about creeds back in 61 when they organized. And John Loughborough has recently lost his wife. She died in childbirth. And he has been having a dream. Not just like a hope for the future, but a real dream. He goes to sleep at night, he dreams this dream, and in the dream, he gets on a ship in New York, he sails around the coast of the United States to Panama. There's no canal yet, so he gets on land, takes a little railroad trek to another ship on the other side, and he lands in California and sets up a big tent and he starts to preach. This is his dream. He dreams again. He said that winter he had about the same dream 20 times. This is the winter of 1867, 1868. And so when Merritt Kellogg shows up from California to the General Conference session, and he stands and makes a rousing appeal for somebody to please come to California and preach, John stands up next and says, I think that might be me. And then there's another guy there, Daniel Bordeaux, who stands and says, I've been dreaming some dreams too. I think I should go with him. And so John and his brand new wife, Maggie, and Daniel and Marion Bordeaux make arrangements, and they become the first official evangelists to California. They begin to preach, and it goes amazing. People come in droves. They start a new church there in Petaluma, which is right across the bay from California. From San Francisco, Petaluma. And they start a little church there. They leave Maggie and Marion to lead the church, while John and Daniel go on to other places like Healdsburg and some other towns that you might or might not know. And the mission is off the ground. Well, James and Ellen White are still back in Battle Creek doing their thing, but in the early 1870s, they sense that something big is happening in California, and Ellen in particular is a pioneer. James is too, but Ellen likes the frontier's edge. So in 1874, this is the first one that I have on the screen here, Ellen White is crossing the bay from San Francisco, and she looks up at Oakland, California. And she says, I think that place has enough population to support a publishing work. Okay. Ellen was kind of like this. She had been brooding over what she had been dreaming about, what she thought God was impressing her of or giving her dreams about. And so she was looking up and she said, I think we need a publishing work here on the West Coast, and I think it's there. The problem was that there were two evangelists who had just done a big tent series. They'd put up a big tent and invited the neighborhood, and they were preaching their hearts out, but nobody came. And it rained the whole time. So these evangelists had left Oakland, hating the place, never wanting to return again, and they were heading north. And Ellen says, I think we should go catch them and bring them back. So they do. It's raining. The wagon's spring is broken. The shoes on the horses, they don't have shoes on the horses. But they make this perilous trek through the rain, and they catch the evangelists and bring them back to Oakland because they want to start a publishing work. And there in Oakland, something else has just been brewing. There's a mansion named the Clark Mansion, named after the person who owns it, a rich guy who owns this mansion. And there are stories that have hit the newspapers of hauntings in the mansion. So the whole town is in shivers, wondering what's going on. They advertise that they'll talk about the hauntings, and lo and behold, they get a big crowd. So those two evangelists that were cursing being drugged back to Oakland now have a great success. They start a church, and they have a base for a publishing effort. But the publishing effort in the West was not the same as the one back in Battle Creek. In many ways, it did the same things. It was certainly communicating the same basic Seventh-day Adventist message. But it was from this press over the next few years, in 1888, that you'd have a couple of guys named Jones, A.T. Jones, and Elliot Wagner come into the mix. And I don't know if you know those names. I'm sure somebody does. What are Jones and Wagner, if you know, known for? The 1888 message of righteousness by faith. Let me just point something out. Geographically, where did that come from? The West Coast. Where the space was allowed for new ideas to be explored. It was an innovation. And it took the denomination by storm. There was some resistance, yes. There's a bigger story there, but that came from the West. And it was an important corrective to emphasize righteousness by faith in Jesus rather than righteousness by works. Just a few years later, 1878, Merritt Kellogg is back. All right, he might come back, we'll see. Merritt Kellogg is back, and this is now from 1859 to 1878, almost 20 years later, that Merritt Kellogg decides he wants to start a hospital. Once again, Ellen has been dreaming. She says, I think we need a hospital on the West Coast. And Merritt finds himself in the right place at the right time, and he builds a sanitarium in St. Helena on Howell Mountain, where PUC is, where I teach. And we have a medical institution. And there's some interesting stories there, but I want to jump to the third one, education. So now we go to, there's Merritt. This is William Granger. Now, if you have any connection to PUC, you've been on campus, you might know the name Granger. Granger Hall, okay? It's a men's residence hall there. It was named after William Granger. In 1882, there was a dream to start the third of the big institutional structures. We had publishing now. It was that whole structure down in Oakland. You have the 1888 message come from there. You have religious liberty thinking come from there and a bunch of other things. And we have the medical work as well. But in 1882, they wanted an education structure. So they decided they were going to build a college. And in 1882, they did. The first president was actually another man, not William Granger. He was the first president of Battle Creek College as well, got things started. But pretty soon, William Granger was in charge. And the college was thriving. They approached it very differently than they did back in Michigan. Over in California, they collaborated with the neighborhood to build the sort of college that would fit the needs of the people locally, which meant that there were relationships with the neighbors that were deeper. William Granger was the president. He had been a teacher for a while under the previous President Brownsburger, and now he was the president, and things were thriving. The school kept growing. The vision was big. And then came a moment of conflict between the East and the West. Now, I want to be delicate in talking about this, but there is a tension between the way that Adventism is practiced sometimes in one part of the country and another. Sometimes it's rural and urban, sometimes it's regional. Whatever the case, things were thriving there at Healdsburg College, which would later become PUC. Another plug for PUC. If you didn't get your sticker, I still have some for you. And William Warren Prescott, who was Education Secretary of the General Conference, came out to see this West Coast school. Now, Prescott was a New England gentleman. He was very proper in all of his ways, and he came out and saw Granger without a suit on. He heard that Granger would sometimes go in the kitchen and help the cook with the cooking. He found out that sometimes the men would come into the residence hall with their boots still on. This was awful. And they weren't vegetarians. They should be vegetarians, he thought. And a few other things like that. So he tried to work with Granger, but Prescott just thought it was not going to work, and so he ousted Granger from the presidency and installed a man who would bring proper regimentation as far as he was concerned. And that went just as well as you would expect it to go out west. The school almost closed. This was now 1896, so it's a little bit later, or 1894 that they did so. And so they had to send that guy away. His name was Frank Howe, good guy. Later wrote the definitive work on parliamentary procedure. He was very rigid, very detail-focused. And he started the School of Agriculture at Syracuse University. So Frank Howe was a good guy, but he just wasn't the sort of guy to tame the wild folks in the West. It's an interesting little combination of ideas, because when John Loughborough, that evangelist, came out west, Ellen White wrote him a letter and said, John, you're going to need to learn to adapt to the California liberality. Didn't mean exactly what it sounds like it meant. Replace maybe generosity, right? And she was talking about the economic system. There were no pennies in the economy, and John was a penny-pinching Northeasterner. And she says, you need to be able to adapt. John came to see it more as adapting in lots of different ways. So we've got California liberality. Here, what the General Conference Education Director didn't like about the West Coast school was what he called Western informality. So put those two together. California liberality, Western informality. It gives you kind of a vibe of what was going on here. But that greater flexibility, whether we call it liberality or generosity or informality, made space for some interesting things to occur. For example, in 1878, 10 years after he arrived, John Loughborough made his way over to Nevada. And he did a tent series, preaching the message in a place in Reno, what is now Reno. I'm not sure it was named Reno yet. A little parking lot that's still a parking lot, actually, outside of a place called Shem's Bar. You probably haven't been there. But he set up his tent, and he was preaching. And among the others who came, it was a very successful series, and it started a church. But among the others that came was this man here, Charles Kinney, a young black man who had been born a slave in the American South, had migrated with his family to Reno, and he was a barber, a very successful barber. And we see in the newspaper reports that after John came into town, it's announced that he'll no longer be barbering at this one place, but he's bought this other business, and he's now the owner of this other barber shop, and it won't be open on Saturdays. Young Charles had been caught by the message. He had accepted the Sabbath, and he had changed his direction. He also took on the personal ministries directorship for this brand new church in Nevada. And James White noticed that this guy was good. Some of the others also noticed that this guy was good. He was a good leader. And so they arranged to pay his way to go to Hillsburg College, which had opened in 1882, the previous year. In 1883, he arrived there, and he trained for the ministry. Charles Kinney would become the first black person to be ordained to the Seventh-day Adventist ministry, something that was made possible by the looser, more inclusive culture in the West. But that kind of theme continues, and I'll just give you a few other examples. The next person here, 1892, Henry Okihira, was born in the island nation of Japan, migrated to California, came in contact with Seventh-day Adventism and decided he wanted to share it with the rest of his people. So he started to do so in the Bay Area. There were many other immigrants from Japan who came into the area. But it wasn't long before William Granger, you remember him, needed a new job. And Okahira at a Vespers at the college made an appeal one night for somebody to go with him to Japan. Grangers were free, needed a job. And so they went, and they became the first missionaries to Japan. Again, something that was made possible by the mixing of cultures and perspectives in the Bay Area. We could go to some other examples like Georgia Burris. Georgia Burris grew up in California, and she began to notice this Adventist mission. She was actually a kid in Hillsburg, where the college was. Her parents were distinctly disinterested in Seventh-day Adventism, but she was finding it very intriguing. And on the objection of her parents, she decided to join the faith, went to the college, and she began to dream. She noticed that most missionaries would go to places in the world and hire an interpreter. She thought, what if we actually learn the language? Different model. What if we learn the culture? What if we stay a long time instead of just breezing through town, and we learn to know the people? And so she began to dream, and she would share her dream, and finally the denomination asked her to be one of the first missionaries to India. The trouble was she was supposed to go with her friend Myrtle, and Myrtle got deathly ill, couldn't go. She was supposed to have a supervisor, Mr. Robinson, but he had to delay his trip. So Georgia pleaded with the General Conference, please send me. The objection was she was a single woman going into a brand new field of missionary work. But she was a West Coast kid. She didn't care, and she prevailed on them to let her go. And so Georgia Burris became the first missionary to the subcontinent of India, and the first single Adventist missionary sent overseas, single woman Adventist missionary. We could go on to the next one. So I hope you're seeing some diversity, and I think that's a strength of West Coast Adventism that we ought to make the most of. Another one was in 1898. A couple of college students from Hillsburg College, now PUC. Notice the plugs. I still have those stickers, by the way. They went to Tucson, Arizona. And they were selling books door to door, and they came across a man named Marcial Serna. They said, you want to buy some religious books? And he says, no, I have plenty of those. I'm a pastor, Methodist pastor. And I said, okay, you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. So they went home that night after their door-to-door work, and they were praying, and they felt impressed they should go back. But they needed an excuse to go back. So they said, what if we ask him to teach us Spanish? A lot of Spanish people in this area. We need to be able to speak Spanish. So they went back the next day and knocked on Marcial's door and said, could you teach us Spanish? We need it for our work. And he said, okay. So they began to sit down, and they would study the Bible in English and Spanish and make comparisons, and this is how they were learning Spanish. But in the process, they were also studying the Bible. The two young college kids got enough courage up to present to him the seventh-day Sabbath, and he listened to them and says, no. He wasn't convinced. They went back and forth, still wasn't convinced. And finally, he was so annoyed with these two brash young college kids that he challenged them to a public debate. They agreed. The date was set. This was a thing back then, to have public debates. The date was set, and the crowd came in. The two young college kids were given the task of going first, and they made their case. Marcial stood up and he said, I'm supposed to rebut what they've just presented, but they've convinced me. I'm going to keep the next Sabbath, and I encourage you to as well. So this Methodist pastor soon became a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, and he was also the first Hispanic Seventh-day Adventist pastor. Again, something special was happening in this place where various cultures were mixing and various perspectives were mixing. it made space for this kind of thing to occur. Another interesting example is the story of Jenny Ireland. Jenny Ireland also grew up in Hillsburg near the college, and she would later go to Battle Creek and get some nurses training, and she came back to California wondering what she could do for the cause. Very early on, she had been involved in the press work and some other things. She was very much mission-minded. And she settled in Southern California in 1896. That says 1906. Something big happened in 1906 too. 1896, and she began to offer, along with a friend, Minnie Summers, she began to offer free health care. Now, as we think of Southern California today, there are lots of hospitals and clinics and things like that. But back in 1896, there wasn't much. So especially for those who didn't have money to send their family members to big institutions far away, this was life-saving. And so she would do free health care, and in the process, she would do Bible readings as well and Bible studies, and people began to be interested in the faith. In 1906, though, there was a particular community that caught her attention in Los Angeles. She would travel by it on the train each day, and she watched as, first of all, some lots were cleared. Then there were tents set up as people moved onto the lots. Then she would see a house being built and another house and another house. Something kind of unique had just happened. A man named James Furlong had agreed to sell lots, buildable lots, to black Americans. And this was not normal. This was not a standard sort of thing. And you had a number of people who had migrated to Los Angeles area, and a number of people from the South who were looking for a better space to live, where they had more freedom and more respect. And it was a very forward-thinking group, and they were building a community there. And so it wasn't long before Jenny shared her vision that at a prayer meeting one night that she felt like she should start some sort of work in this community, share the faith with this burgeoning community. The next day, her friend Sarah called and said, "I think my postman lives in Furlong Tract in that neighborhood." So the two of them rushed out and they tracked down the postman as he was delivering mail. And they said, "Can we start a Bible study in your home?" And he said, probably not what you would expect him to. He said, "Sure, I think my wife would like that." His name was Theodore Troy. And this became the first Black Seventh-day Adventist church west of the Mississippi. Just a couple of years, a year later, they had built a building. The year after that, they dedicated the first congregation. And Jenny would go on, and she would pastor that church for 6 years. Then she took some people from the church that she had trained to do Bible work, and she went and started another church in another community in Watts. And she led that church for a good while as well. We could talk about Sarah McCowan, 1914. The largest population of Chinese people outside of China was in San Francisco. This is my great-great-grandmother. I didn't even know this story until a couple of years ago. And she felt like the faith should be shared there. So she, too, started a church. Started first with an English language school, started a church. She led the church for about 6 years. And it became the first Seventh-day Adventist Chinese church outside of China in the United States. The story that I want to tell, I'm rushing through this, and there's a reason for that. I want to make sure there's room for you to ask some questions if you have them. But I really want to tell this story here. So in the early 1900s, Ellen White had come back from Australia. In 1891, the General Conference had sent her to Australia, I think in part to get her out of the country. Okay. I'm not anti-General Conference. This is just what happened. They didn't always like her messages because she was often pushing them to make progress that they weren't ready to make. In 1891, at the General Conference session, she had called for them to go into the American South and work with the former slave population because she argued that essentially many people were still enslaved because they were robbed of education and things like that. And she argued that the church should send people in to provide education. General Conference listened to her appeal, and voted to send her out of the country. A few years later, some real progress was made in the area she was appealing for. So it did happen, but not real soon. So she had been in Australia for some time, and she came back in 1900, landed at Elmshaven. Some of you have talked to me about Elmshaven. That was her home when she came back. And she started to look around with the idea that she was retired, but then she realized there was more work to do. And she began to develop a vision that she wanted to have healthcare institutions in Southern California. John Harvey Kellogg, if you know him, had just recently kind of broken from the denomination, so we needed some new healthcare centers. And so she went down to Southern California. She had some partners in the process. She identified some buildings that had been built during the boom, and now the population had receded and they could be bought cheaply. She went to the General Conference and said, we need to buy these buildings because the population is coming back to Los Angeles. And they said, you're crazy. Okay, some people said that. And even if you're not crazy, we don't have the money for that. So what do you think Ellen did? Went back to Elmshaven and just sat on her hands? She prayed. She checked her own bank account. She talked to friends, and she got the money to buy the buildings. And as a result, we have Loma Linda University Medical School and Loma Linda University. But then in 1915, Ellen White died. Next picture. And that very fall, the General Conference Council convened in Loma Linda with a grim task in mind. That grim task was the task of closing Loma Linda University Medical School. It's called College of Medical Evangelists. They were going to close it. Now, why were they going to close it? For good reasons. It was becoming more and more expensive with the new state standards, and they just didn't have the money. Okay, so these are not bad guys. General Conference guys are not bad guys. But Ellen White not only invested in these institutions, she had also invested in people. One of those people was Hetty Hurd. Hetty Hurd heard of what was going on. Notice the play? No, nobody laughed. Okay. Have you heard of Hetty Hurd? I'll stop. All right, so Hetty Hurd got wind of what was going on. They were going to close the medical training center for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Okay. Ellen White was barely cold in the ground. And Hetty just thought this was a bad idea. So what did Hetty do? Now, Hetty had been a leader herself. She was kind of amazing. She did mission training schools all over the world. She built them and led them. She had helped to build Avondale College down in Australia and a whole bunch of other stuff. But at this moment, she gathered together 3 friends, 3 other women, and while the General Conference was in session, they knocked on the door. This was a breach of protocol. But the kind people inside let them in and said, what would you like? And they came in with a plan to scale up instead of scaling back, to build White Memorial Hospital. And they argued that people would give to a memorial for Ellen White, who had just died. They also made postcards of old Adventist pioneers, and they sold them. And they had this whole plan for saving the school, and not just saving it, but building it bigger. And the General Conference leaders listened, gave them the opportunity to do it. They raised the money, and as a result, we have Loma Linda University Medical School. But notice that there was a bit of contrast, a tug between the East and the West. And it was the West that was pulling us forward. Nobody back in Battle Creek was bad. They were doing the Lord's work too. But there was a unique role that the West Coast Adventism had in the story, and that was to pull us forward, to innovate, to find ways to be pioneering in the mission. And I want to encourage you with the idea, I want to press forward the idea that in many ways we are still the independently minded people in the United States. Not that there isn't independence elsewhere too. But on a whole, the center of gravity is much more independent here. It's much more creative. It's more diverse. And we have the opportunity to lead this thing forward with mission innovations. I'm not saying we should change anything about the faith. So please don't misunderstand me. But as to how the faith speaks to the world around us, the next big thing in how we share the faith, if that innovation is going to occur, it's most likely to occur here. So let's start praying about what God wants us to do. All right? There's my presentation. Are there any questions or additions to the story for those of you who know some of this? Yes, John.
Well, I'd just like to ask a question about Merritt Kellogg.
Yes.
John Harvey Kellogg was really a frustration to Ellen White, and how he managed that hospital back there, and then eventually going into pantheism. But Merritt Kellogg must have been completely different than him.
That's a really good question. And I've done quite a bit of research on Merritt Kellogg. He was different, but he had some problems too. Okay. Merritt Kellogg was, one of his friends once wrote in a letter, and I think it captured him really well. He was one of the best men among us, his friend said, to make a good first impression, not so good for the long stay. Okay. So Merritt Kellogg was the innovator. He was the guy you would expect to show up and get things started in California. Shortly thereafter, he was down in Southern California. He would go to Australia and do some of the mission work on the Pitcairn missionary ship, which was also a West Coast innovation. He would end up bouncing from institution to institution, starting many along the way. So his, I guess, downside was probably his strength, his superpower as well, that he would get things started and then move on. But as far as the relationship with Ellen White, there were some moments that were rocky when his brother was in the process of leaving the church. But in the end, he stayed with the church and stayed with Ellen, and things worked out. Did that answer your question there? Yeah. Yeah. So that's a wild family, the Kellogg's. He was. Try 16. Yeah. So there are two mothers involved. The first 5 were from John Preston Kellogg's first wife, Mary. So it was Mary Kelsey. The second wife was Anne Stanley Kellogg. Anne, yeah. And she was pretty young, but when John Preston's first wife was dying, she said to her husband, "Go get Anne. She'll take care of the kids." And so that was the assignment, go get Anne. So he did.
What did you say the 6 S's are? State of the dead, second coming, sanctuary, Sabbath, spirit of prophecy.
Yes, did salvation by faith. That one came later.
So this is like the fundamental beliefs initially.
Yes, that's the core to them. You know, if you look at the Seventh-day Adventist 28 fundamental beliefs now, you find that they're kind of spread out more. There's more detail. It's 28 instead of 6. But mostly they're in sync with those. So it hasn't really changed. It's just expanded in detail. Yeah.
I could ask you one more question.
Yeah.
Nobody else has got any questions. You mentioned that lady that promoted the idea of collecting funds in memorial to Ellen White, who just died.
Yes. Hetty Hurd. Yes.
And we have the White Memorial Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
How is that related to Loma Linda?
So it's directly related in the sense of they needed a hospital that would meet the current medical standards in order to have the medical students train in it. Yes. And so this is how White Memorial Hospital came to be, and it was for that purpose. Yeah. Yeah, so she was, that's talking about Georgia Burris. Georgia Burris. She was not single the whole time, but she was in India for the next, 3.5 decades? She had a couple of furloughs, but I think it ends up being over 30 years. But she was there, and another male missionary came along later named Luther Burgess. And people joked, your names are almost the same. You should just be married. They got married. So, but you had something more to the question. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, so she was there a long time, and she was key to organizing the work across the field. So it wasn't just that she was first. She also stayed, and she built up the structures. She was the field, almost, she and her husband together were almost like the president of the field for a while. She was, yeah. Yeah, and I mentioned that there are many things that as I prepare for 2 presentations on all of this, it's really a question of what I don't tell you. Something I haven't really emphasized enough, but it comes up a few times, is the leadership of women in the story. So you have Georgia Burris, you have Jenny Ireland, who starts the first Black Adventist church west of the Mississippi, and she's the pastor of the church for a number of years. You have Sarah McCowan, my great-great-grandma, who also started a church, and then she pastored the church for about 6 years. And you have Hetty Hurd's leadership. Another interesting contrast with East versus West, Battle Creek versus Northern California, is that in 1881, the General Conference actually considered a resolution to ordain women to ministry. I don't know if you all know about that, but it shows up in the Adventist Review. This was proposed on the floor. And in the Adventist Review, which is published in Michigan, it says this was sent to committee. And everybody wonders what happened. Did they vote it? What happened after committee? On the West Coast, we had Signs of the Times by that point. It reported that the resolution was adopted to ordain women to ministry. So you have a difference, whatever we want to do with that, you have a difference in culture in the 2 places, that one is willing to say, yeah, we did that, and the other's kind of making it less clear. But Hillsborough College comes the next year, and they advertise widely that they're looking for young women and men to go into full-time ministry. Yeah.
About 1950, my dad, our family moved to Sanford, Arizona.
Okay.
And out of probably 10, 15 miles away was a Spanish church, Spanish-speaking church. And he didn't have a pastor at that time, so my dad would go out there and through translation preach sermons. And one of the, I think that one of the very first men in that church was baptized, still lived right in that vicinity.
Mm-hmm.
He had a large family. And years later, my mother came across an article about that church that
Okay.
suggested that it was the first church, I don't know geographically where, but it was the first Adventist church, I don't know, Hispanic church. I don't know if it was just in Arizona, I don't remember that. I was just wondering if that...
Yeah, so you're asking a good question. I'm not sure I can confirm it. I'd have to go back to my notes and see. It probably is, if that's what they said.
It was from an article that
Okay.
was in the Gleaner.
So you're wondering if that's Marcial Cerna's church?
Yeah, if it had anything to do with...
Yeah. And I wish I knew. I don't. Good question, though. Yeah.
So Hetty Haskell, I've heard referred as Hurd being her maiden name?
Correct. Yes. Yes. Oh, I put Haskell up there, didn't I? So she married Stephen Haskell. If you know Stephen Haskell's writings, perhaps, he did some stuff on Daniel and Revelation. He had an interesting little life experience. He married a woman who was in her 40s when he was 17. And then she died because she got older, and he wasn't quite old enough to die yet. And then he married Hetty Hurd, and she was also the same age when he married her. So
So they were the same age, or she was the same age as her prior wife?
that one, same age as the prior wife when he married them. He married both of them when they were in their mid-40s, or early 40s, actually. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the first one he fell into naturally. He was 17, and he was I think it was her father, was dying, and he said, "Please take care of Mary for me." And he promised he would, and then he couldn't figure out how to do that except for to marry her, so he married her. And it was good for him because he was illiterate, and she taught him how to read. She taught him math. She homeschooled the guy, and he became one of the best authors in the denomination. But if not for his wife homeschooling him, he wouldn't have been. All kinds of fun stories in the background here. All right, we can wrap this up here pretty quick. If there are any more comments or questions, though, I'm happy to take them. Yes? Which year? This would have been about the exact year. I'm not sure I can give you. It was 1904, I think. That's when she started to become serious about acquiring the properties. Yeah. So I think it was about that time frame because that's when she starts to really look at options.
So prior to this one lady that went over to India, Georgia,
Yes.
the missionaries would go and just talk to people and leave?
Yeah, so they.
Weird. How do you convert people without knowing them or living among them?
You're asking a good question. Yeah. So the question was whether before Georgia kind of reinvented the way missionary work was done, how did they do it? And it's true that it tended to be shorter term. They wouldn't build relationships the same way. They didn't learn the local language in most cases. That wasn't an expectation. They would just hire an interpreter. So there was quite a bit of relational distance. She had a vision for building relationships, and that's probably part of why she stayed for decades. You build relationships. That's how you share the faith. Did that clarify? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, somebody else had a hand up, I think. Jamie.
Yeah, I've always kind of wondered, going back to medicine in 1878 here.
Yes.
It's where we had sanitariums, and they were using water and sunlight and massage and rest and diet.
Yeah.
And I've always kind of wondered with that scope of practice, and also, I don't know that there was much herbology used at that time, but I'm thinking back to where God created all these different plants with herbs that heal our body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm just wondering, was there ever any thought back at that time about going that direction, or did Ellen end up specifically getting visions that they were to go into medicine and using pharmaceuticals?
Yeah.
Did you have any thought on any of that?
Specifically pharmaceuticals versus
Going into the herbology
herbology. Yeah.
pharmaceuticals where God had already brought
Yes.
healing in plants already anyway.
Yeah.
And was there that thought of going that direction versus using man-made synthetic drugs?
Yes. Yes. So this is a good question. Thanks for highlighting that. Because yes, Ellen White did talk about natural supplements, things you should eat that can help you, these kinds of things. So more in the line of herbology. And she talked about simple methods of positively stimulating the system, such as hot and cold treatments, things like that. And she warned against some of the other medicines of the time. Now, the medicines of the time, it's helpful to understand, were often just strong substances that somebody was throwing at a sick person to see if it did something, right? So it wasn't refined, it wasn't well researched. You know, you have arsenic and all those classic examples. So she was contrasting diet, herbs, things like that, and these simpler treatments with some of that craziness. What she would say about medical research today and pharmaceuticals developed, I don't know, because we didn't really have that in place. It's a good question to ponder. Yeah.
I just want to add a little bit of what I listened to on audio about Ellen White. Towards the end of her life, she was having a problem with her tooth, and when they went to remove it, she didn't have any, she didn't have anything, med assistance.
Okay.
And like you said, I mean, when we looked at medicine, how harsh were those drugs or chemicals too?
Yeah. Yeah, there was, if you look at the historical newspapers of this time, of Ellen White's lifetime, like every other page is advertising some miracle cure that somebody cooked up in their back shed, I guess. I don't know. And they're claiming it'll cure everything. And she was saying, no, let's just not go there. There's some basic things we know work. Let's focus on those. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, a lot of those, like, when you look at the time and you see bottles from those time, they would have something and it's like tonic and morphine and it's good for everything.
Mm-hmm.
All the opioids started as a medication, and it had cocaine in it, so.
Yeah, it wasn't like, yeah, like you said, it was potion stocks,
Yeah.
yeah. It's definitely a good thought.
I think we can look back and say, yeah, let's not do those things.
Some difference,
Yeah.
yeah, I think for sure.
Yeah. All right. Yes.
Is there a single place where the stories that you told us, we could read them and share with other people?
Yeah, so most of them you can get in one of two books if you want to get a book. One is a classic book by Harold Macomber called Pioneering the Message in the Golden West. And Pacific Press has made that re-available. Even though it's an old book from the 1940s, you can get it. Okay. Another one, and it's Sabbath, so I don't want to try to sell my book. Another one is one that I published earlier this year called Walking with the Pioneers. So if you look up my crazy last name with that title, you'll find it. First book is called Pioneering the Message in the Golden West by Harold Macomber. And it's a good read. If you like stories, he does a good job telling stories. So, but naturally, my book's better. Probably not, but it's good too, I hope. All right. Yes, David.
Curious as to how you got involved in your interest in this.
Yeah. So it started way back. I think I've always been interested in Adventist heritage. I went to Southern Adventist University. I mean, send your friends to PUC. But I went there, and it was good. It was good, too. And I took an Adventist heritage class, and it just caught me. Okay. So what I did as a pastor from the very beginning is whenever I would go to a local area, I would do my best to search in archives, talk to, the oldest people in the congregation, and try to collect the local story. And the reason for that is that I feel like when we know what story we're part of, history is not just about the past. It's mostly about the present and the future when we tell history. The stories we tell define us. So I found that it was helpful for me personally as part of the mission to understand what had come before, to value that, and to continue that in some way. And so every place that I served, I would do the same thing. And for the book, Walking with the Pioneers, I did the same thing where I am now. And I've had more years to research it, and I just find the story fascinating. But I think it has practical implications, and that's what draws me. Yeah.
So, this may not be the original pioneers, but in my family's history, two different branches, but both immigrated from Ukraine. And on my grandfather's side, they were in Oklahoma,
Okay.
My grandfather had to quit school to farm. And I'm curious, then on the other side, I recently learned that somehow this group coming in from the Ukraine became Seventh-day Adventists during the immigration process. And a group of them, because of the conversion, the group split. The Lutherans refused to live with the Adventists, so they continued into Canada.
Okay.
And the new Adventists stayed in South Dakota.
Hmm.
Is there any history on what was going on in the immigrant populations in the middle part of the country in the growth of Seventh-day Adventism?
Yeah. So my first thought was another part of the Adventist story that's been largely untold is that of ship missionaries. We had a big push for ship missionaries. People would go to the docks. They would try to get literature on the boat. So now you have a captive audience on the ship for the next few weeks, right? And they have opportunity to really soak some things in that way. And they would also take it to other parts of the world. And sometimes the missionaries would actually be on the ship. And again, you have a captive audience. So it could have been there. Now, as far as the Midwest, we did have some distinctive language groups. So Ukrainian might have been one of them. I don't know.
These are actually German immigrants to Ukraine.
Oh, okay.
Immigrated to the United States.
So South Dakota, there was a big group of German-speaking Adventists in South Dakota.
And
We-
Alabama, but they would say they were from Nebraska because they didn't want to be labeled as Oklahoma.
Interesting. Okay. So there was some bias they were trying to get around. Yeah, but we actually had a German-speaking seminary, Clinton Theological Seminary, and it went away about the time of World War I because we were fighting the Germans, and so there was more pressure to integrate with the English-speaking groups and not look dangerous.
Is anybody doing this? Because I also learned from another Adventist pastor that in Oklahoma there is a large documented history of these German Ukrainians coming into Oklahoma and the way they built their homes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that they had their own institutions in Ukraine.
Okay.
Left. So I'm wondering if this is the group that did this German seminary, German language seminary when they arrived in the U.S. Is there anybody documenting any of this?
So I'm trying to think of who. I haven't done the primary work myself. I've done some exploration, but I don't feel like I can speak with authority. Probably the best source is actually the Center for Adventist Research at Andrews, Kevin Burton. I would talk to Kevin Burton if you're doing some serious research or you want to just see what they have. Yeah. A lot of interesting questions and comments. I feel like we're probably going to wear you out pretty quick, so maybe one or two more if they're there, and if not, we'll just close with a prayer, and if you have some other questions, I can stay by afterwards. Anyone want to pose one last question for the group? Yeah.
And who is your favorite character in all of your research? Why?
Well, Hetty Hurd's a good candidate. Also, Jenny Ireland. One that I didn't tell you about is Sarah Peck. So Sarah Peck started out as a teacher. She helped to start Maplewood Academy, Minnesota. She also helped to start the college in South Africa and Avondale College in Australia. And she did all of this. She started a whole bunch of schools. Okay, and she also wrote about 20 books for Adventist school curriculum. And she was a very tenacious lady. She just made a huge impact on the shape of Adventist education, and we haven't told her story too much. I think we need to tell Sarah Peck is her name, Sarah Peck's story. But one of the things I like best about her actually is encapsulated by a moment when she was teaching at Union College in Nebraska, where a census taker came through. Now, she was famously unmarried. The census taker asked all the questions. She answered all the questions except two. And the two questions she would not answer were, marital status, right, and age. And so, yeah, it went to court. I mean, the census taker came back and said, if you don't give me this information, you'll be fined. And she said, that's fine. I have money to pay it. So this is all reported in the newspapers. He came back again, and it's national newspapers, by the way. She was kind of a folk hero for this whole thing. And he came back again and said, I'll have you charged, and she said, that's fine. So he did. He followed through, and she was indicted by a federal grand jury for thwarting the census. Yeah, issues there. But she went into court, and the way that the newspapers described it is she strolls into court with a smile on her face, asked how she pleads. She says, guilty as charged. And then she pulls a roll of dollars from her pocket and pays the fine. So she's kind of a hero. But it kind of encapsulates the tenacity of this woman. She was a strong personality, and that's how she was able to help start a high school and then a college and then another college and then another elementary school and keep going and build a whole Adventist school curriculum. The strength of somebody's personality. I love the story because I don't think I would have liked to live with her. But it reminds me that I'm glad she had that strength of personality. Without it, she wouldn't have done what she did. So she was indicted in 1910, but she had already done quite a bit of her work of building schools prior to that. 1888 was the first one. Yeah, and she was born in 1868 and died in 1968, 100 years. Yeah. Sarah Peck. And if you want to, by the way, there's encyclopedia.adventist.org, Adventist Encyclopedia Online. I wrote the article for her and for Jenny Ireland, but there are lots of other interesting articles there if you want to just browse that this afternoon. Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists. It's free online. So you can go to encyclopedia.adventist.org, and that's the direct link. Lots of good stories. You can also search it. So you could search PUC, you could search Nevada, and see what comes up. Yes?
What were two people that you had to cut while doing this presentation that are honorable mentions?
Lula Joseph. Lula Joseph was one of those early pastors that graduated from Hillsburg College. And she was actually one of the first pastors here in Nevada. So I probably should have told her story. But she started out as an 18-year-old kid who just decided she was going to go door to door and start a church in Riverside, California, and so she did. And people encouraged her to go off to school and train for it, and so she did. And she came here. Her boyfriend broke up with her, though, shortly before her graduation because he felt like she shouldn't be preaching as a woman. And she chose her preaching over her boyfriend. So I love that. Yeah.
As an educator, I don't know if this comes in handy, but a lot of these stories are where as children strong-willed.
Yes.
A lot of times parents are like, this is a curse, but as I have shared with some of my family members, the strong will is to be mentored because it's there for a purpose.
Yes. Yes. You asked for two stories, didn't you? Lula Joseph. Another one would be, there are probably too many. Another one would be Lizzie Granger. I told about William Granger, but Lizzie Granger was quite a significant leader in the mission field in Japan. And then she came back and she started an orphanage, and she married George Butler, who was one of the GC presidents, and continued to do big things. I feel like her story gets overshadowed by his, so it'd be worth telling. No, Lizzie was William's wife.
I thought you said she married.
She did. After William died. He died in Japan. Yeah. Yeah, he's buried in Tokyo. So I give the short version, and then it's muddled. Sorry about that. All right, well, let's wrap up. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this. And you're welcome. This has been fun for me. And let's pray to end our program. Is there any other announcement we need to make, Jamie, or are we good to go? Okay, so I'll pray, and then I can stay around a little while if you want to chat about any other details. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for these good people, for them being part of this grand Adventist mission. We've thought a lot about that today. And I don't know what each person's relationship to it is. Maybe curiosity. Maybe they were born into it. Maybe they're looking for the next big thing. I pray that you will speak to us about the opportunities. Help us to hear you clearly and follow through, because I think it's apparent that this still matters greatly in our world. It's still a gift to our neighbors, to ourselves, to our friends. I pray that you'll help us to find ever better ways to share effectively. Thank you in Jesus' name.